Hmm.
Welcome to Inside Voices, a well-read magazine, Between the Pages podcast. I'm Robert Gwaltney with my friend and co-host Jeffrey Lofton, and we're both so excited to enter into conversation with Curtis Chin. Curtis, welcome.
Happy to be here.
So, Curtis, before we get started, I'm going to share a little bit about you with our listeners. Curtis, a co-founder of the Asian American Writers Workshop in New York City, Curtis Chin served as the nonprofit's first executive director. He went on to write for network and cable television before transitioning to social justice documentaries. Chin has screened his films at over 600 venues in 20 countries. He's written for CNN, Bon Appetit, the Detroit Free Press, and the Emancipator Boston Globe. A graduate of the University of Michigan, Chin has received awards from ABC Disney Television, New York Foundation for the Arts, National Endowment for the Arts, and more. His memoir, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant, was published by Little Brown in fall 2023. His essay, in Bon Appetit, was selected for Best Food Writing in America 2023. Jeffrey?
Curtis, we're so glad you were able to join us. Thanks so much for being here. So, writing a memoir, that's really telling one's truth. Why did you decide to chronicle your life in a book?
It actually started off as a family project. When my siblings started having kids and we all left Michigan, I really thought it was sad that this next generation of my family wouldn't know this 100-year history that we had in Detroit. And so I originally was just jotting down these stories, hoping to share with them. But after I was spending a few years doing that, I was like, I'm spending a lot of time working on these stories. I should probably get paid for this. So that's when I thought, like, okay, how do I sell a memoir?
And how do you sell a memoir?
Well, it's really quite different, right? I mean, if you're just writing a memoir for yourself, um, you know, you can be as loosey-goosey in some ways, right? But if you're thinking that you're going to sell it to an outside audience of strangers, I think it takes a lot more effort. In particular, I think that there's a difference between fiction readers and nonfiction readers. I think that with fiction, a lot of people may pick up a book just for entertainment value. But I think with nonfiction, you know, I think most nonfiction readers pick up the book hoping to learn something specific. They're dealing with an issue in their life. They're much more targeted, right? And so I think that I really had to ask myself, well, what in my life could I actually, share with people and that they could learn from? And so I think that was sort of the challenge, which I hadn't really thought about. I always thought they were funny stories. I thought they were interesting stories, but to think about, well, how are my experiences going to be relevant to strangers, across the country? That was something I really hadn't thought about.
Hmm. Do you,
So,
do, Go ahead,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Jeffrey.
No, go ahead.
So your book's as much about, of course, you as your family and the people in your community, both the Chinese American community, the Detroit community, the queer community. What was behind your decision to tell their stories alongside your own?
I don't know. Maybe I'm a middle child and I don't like to stick out. Maybe I don't like to use the word I too much. I didn't mind centering it, but I also felt like I love my family and I love my hometown of Detroit. And I felt like writing a family story might help bring our family, closer together. And I also thought that like writing a story about Detroit would get people to sort of see it differently. Um, and I've been really happy about that. It's also a very 80s memoir. So if you grew up that generation, I think a lot of those people, from my age, love the fact that I like sprinkle in all this pop reference from TV to music to movies. So that's all good. So. I did want the book to operate on all these different levels so that all these people had different entry points to it. If you're interested in, talking about racial identity, it's in there. If you think I'm interested in coming out stories, it's in there. If you're interested in Chinese food, in Chinese restaurants, that's all in there. There's a little bit of something for everybody, I think.
And Curtis, you mentioned that nonfiction is really when people want to learn something, and maybe fiction is more for entertainment. But I mean, it's a really entertaining story.
Oh, thanks.
And Robert mentioned that you cover, you know, being Chinese American, uh, being from Detroit, being queer. So what has been the reaction from those communities to your book?
Everybody loves the book. I'm kidding. Uh, well, I mean, I did just come back from Michigan, where my book was honored by the state as one of the notable books last year, and so that was kind of special. And it really has struck a chord, I think, with the people in the hometown. Like, for instance, I'm going back to Michigan in about 2 weeks to do events for everybody from Ford Motor Company to the Detroit Pistons. I mean, it's crazy, uh, the response that it's gotten. And yesterday at the event, the state's poet laureate actually came up to me and said, like, everybody in back here is talking about your book. And she said it like 5 times. You know what I mean? Like, everybody's talking about your book. Everybody's talking about your book. So, yeah, it's just great. I mean, to feel like your hometown, appreciates what you did and how you wrote about it and they feel connected to it. And yeah, I just feel really happy about it. The book has totally exceeded my expectations. So,
Did you have any reservations initially, having knowing this story about your not just yourself, but your whole world was coming out to Detroit and your whole family? Were you concerned?
maybe I should have been more. I mean, wondering how this might impact the people around me. With that said, would I have written the book differently? I don't think so. I'm really happy with the book, regardless of what happened to it from a sales perspective. I really like the book and I really stand by it. And the stories that are in there, were important to me growing up. There are some stories that didn't make it in that I would have loved to put in, but I could understand why, the people around me suggested not including them because part of it is, again, creating a narrative arc for readers so that they know what they can get something out of it, right? A journey that they can appreciate. And so, yeah, I don't think I was ever scared. Well, I was never scared of people's reactions. I was scared of making sure that I could recount things to the best of my ability, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So Curtis, you differentiated between nonfiction and fiction readers. And of course your memoirs, everything you learned in a Chinese restaurant. Well, but what did you learn from the process of writing your memoir that surprised you most
Learn about me or about the writing process?
about you? Well, it could be either.
Uh, well, I have to admit that I'm not the most introspective person. The way I've just dealt with things in life is always just to move forward, move on whenever there's been any difficulties. I think that's part of how I grappled with growing up in Detroit, where during the 80s, it was a tough time for my hometown. Not only did you have the auto industry that was struggling, but you had crack cocaine, you had AIDS. I knew 5 people murdered by the time I was 18 years old. Like, my way of sort of dealing with all that destruction, shall we say, was just to move forward, like to find positive outcomes, right? Or things that could come out of it. And so I think that's okay as a human being. We can move on with our lives. We don't have to remember everything. It's okay to forget things. But I think when you're writing a memoir, you do have to pick at those scabs. You have to go back and revisit things and analyze what they mean. And so I was actually dealing with a lot of stuff that I probably had never processed, in the last 20, 30, 40 years, right? Because I just never felt the need to. Um, and to be honest with you, if I weren't writing a memoir, I don't know if I would need to go through these exercises. But I did feel like if I was writing the book, I would have to do it, and that's why I did it. So,
So you mentioned having to pick at scabs when you are writing your memoir. There's this passage that's not too far into the book about a moment where you realize that it's possible for family to stop loving. Talk a little bit about that.
yeah, with everybody, a lot of your cues about relationships comes from your parents, right? Or the people around you. In my case, my mom and dad had an arranged marriage. The circumstances were specifically that my grandmother wanted my dad to drop out of college and work in the family business because they'd moved to a larger location and they needed more help. And part of that was that he wanted my dad to get married so that he would have extra help, like free labor from a daughter-in-law. And so she had arranged for my dad to go back to Hong Kong, or shall I say, go to Hong Kong, because he was born in America. But she had arranged for him to go to Hong Kong to meet this girl. But when he got there, that girl turned out already had a boyfriend, and so my dad had to go find someone on his own, because he didn't want to return to Detroit empty-handed. But because my grandmother never had a say in who my dad chose as a partner, she never accepted my mom. And so to me, that made me really think early on, like, wow, whoever you pick to be your partner really matters because, if your parents don't accept, they're going to make your life hell, which is sort of what my grandmother did to my dad, right? Really never fully embracing him and not treating him very well. I don't go too deep into the book about how my grandmother didn't treat my dad particularly well, but yeah, so that really made me think like, oh God, I would never want my parents to not like the person I'm with, right? I would never want that to happen to me. So that was partly, that impacted the coming out process for me.
Did your parents' experience with your grandmother how did that shape them? Um, how did they react to you when you did find someone for yourself?
Well, that's why I waited. I mean, spoiler alert, this book it's divided into three sections of 8 stories each, 888, because that's good luck to Chinese people. 8 stories in elementary, middle school, 8 in high school, and then 8 in college. Um, but I actually don't come out in this book to my parents. I come out to a lot of other people, but not my parents. And that's because I knew that I was never going to come out to my parents until I found a partner because I did not want my parents worrying about me. Um, one thing that I do talk about where, well, people ask me, well, how is coming out to an Asian family or a Buddhist family different than coming out, in a non-Asian, Christian or Jewish or Muslim family or something like that? And, I said, for us, we don't have this concept of heaven and hell. But what we do have is shame, filial piety, honoring the family, things like that. And those things are also very strong forces to sort of keep you in the closet, right? And so for me, because I knew my parents were also literally risking their lives working in that Chinese restaurant in the inner city of Detroit, the worst neighborhood, that I just could not bring myself to ever want to feel like I was disappointing them. And so, or, adding to their stress of like wondering, what would happen to me because at that time AIDS was around and, so many people were dying that I also thought that like if I did come out, that they would worry about me getting AIDS, and dying. And so I didn't want to add to their stress. And so those are the reasons I sort of kept in the closet. It really wasn't about protecting myself because I knew I'd be fine. I'm pretty independent. I can carry myself, but I feel like I wanted to be protective of my parents.
So, Curtis, I'm interested in knowing. So, your family's restaurant welcomed people from a broad swath of community fabric. By day, white collar professionals, then in the evenings, drug dealers, gay men, sex workers. Was this diversity something that your family explored in conversation with you when you were growing up?
We never talked about it. It just was, I mean, during the summer months, we literally were there 80 hours a week. We worked 7 days a week, open to close, right? And so that's the beauty of that Chinese restaurant. I always say, like, even though I was literally physically stuck in that Chinese restaurant, I got to see the whole city because literally everybody from the mayor on down to the pimps and prostitutes would come in. And so we got to interact with all of them. And I think that, in the book, one of the pivotal moments for me as a kid was, I noticed that my mom would oftentimes just, hang out with the prostitutes. Well, not like, what I mean, like chit chat with them, like in the lobby and, as their order were coming and stuff like that. And, as I was, just coming into my own in terms of my sexuality, I was testing the water by asking my mom, like, Mom, you know what they do for a living, right? And she's like, Yeah. I mean, we all have to make a living somehow. And the fact that she answered that way just showed that maybe she's not as traditional as I thought, or maybe she might have some, she might surprise me, like if I ever came out, right? And so, but in terms of issues of diversity and race, yeah, we did talk about stuff like that. It's Detroit. It's a very racially polarized city. But again, the conversations happened uh, in very surprising ways and at several in surprising moments. Like my mom hated Diana Ross because she thought that it was unfair that Diana Ross got to sing lead when the better singer, who was, darker skinned and a little heavier set, didn't get to do it. And my mom was very aware of colorism and size issues, discrimination and stuff like that. And, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Because she said that, Diana Ross got to sing lead because she looks more white, you know. And so, oh, that's something, like surprised me. But it's not like she sat down and said any of this stuff. It's just like off the cuff comments, right? Yeah.
Talking about your mother, and it makes me think of a moment with your father and his ability to just talk with anybody, and so his ability to sort of find common ground with just about anybody, and he'd encouraged you to talk to strangers. Sounds like your mother did too. But
Yeah.
yeah, his example. Tell us about that and how that the impact it had on you.
Well, I don't know the specific story you're referring to, but the general thing is that people often ask me, like, given the title of your book, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant, what is the one thing that you learned from your parents, or what was the most important thing, or the first thing? And I always say, the most important thing I learned from my parents, and the first thing was when you're a young kid, oftentimes your parents will say, don't talk to strangers. My parents actually gave me the exact opposite advice. They were like, talk to strangers. And who they were talking about were the people sitting in our dining room because my mom didn't graduate high school. My dad went to community college for a couple semesters. They didn't necessarily know what opportunities existed outside of those four walls of that Chinese restaurant, but they knew they had a dining room full of people who did. And so anytime, my dad met a customer, because he was the waiter, he'd call all six of us kids over to say hi, and ask these people questions like, oh, what do you do for a living? How'd you get your job? How much money do you make? And so this idea of talking to people who are different from you, but also more importantly, not being afraid of asking questions when you don't know something and not being afraid of asking for help when you need it. I mean, those are all really important lessons that, my parents taught me that it's okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And my dad was a kid who grew up in Chinatown. He never really physically got out of Chinatown, but he could strike up a conversation with anybody. And I also realized at some point that having conversations with people isn't just about talking. A lot of it's about listening. And my dad loved listening to other people and their stories. And I think that, because of that, um, he was very engaged in the conversations with people. He didn't necessarily do all the talking per se, but he was definitely an equal partner in those discussions with those people.
Hmm.
Curtis, I heard you say in a previous interview that you describe yourself as the perpetual Chinese waiter. Talk a little bit about what that means to you.
Service. That's what a Chinese waiter does, I think, or hopefully does. I know people have said like, wait, the Chinese restaurants I go to, all the waiters are really mean. But in our Chinese restaurant, like it was about service. And for me, it's like I go through life asking people, how can I help you? Can I get you something? And I think it's a really great attitude to have that I enjoy because I always feel like, even if you're with someone just for an hour or whatever short amount of time you're with somebody, if you can make it easier for them or just make it a little more pleasant, why not? It doesn't hurt, right? It brings you more joy, then it's a win-win for everybody. And that's sort of the attitude that I've sort of carried on with things, whether it was, when I went off to college or I went off to New York and co-founded the Asian American Writers Workshop, this wonderful nonprofit that's still in existence today, or any of the volunteer work that I do. It's just this idea of service. There's a lot of value in that and a lot of, joy that I get out of it.
Great. I think we should all be Chinese waiters.
Yeah. You don't even need to give me a tip. I'll still do it. You know
Absolutely.
what I mean? Yeah. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the organization you co-founded?
Yeah, it's a nonprofit called the Asian American Writers Workshop. So I'd gone to the University of Michigan, graduated, and the book sort of ends, um, you know, I like the way I bookended the book. So the very first paragraph in the book is about my great great grandfather standing on a dock in China, trying to decide his fate, what he's going to do, and ultimately deciding that he was going to go to America to seek his fortune. And the last scene in my book is actually me standing on the train platform in Detroit, getting ready to leave my ancestral homeland of Detroit to go off and start my journey in life. And so this isn't in the book, but what happened was that I moved to New York City to become a writer. Within a year, I co-founded this group with a bunch of other 20-something-year-old Asian Americans to create a space for ourselves, to learn, to become better writers, first and foremost, but then also to navigate the process of publishing and finding an agent and all this stuff. And we literally just started off with writing workshops, and then after a couple months, we said, hey, let's do it. Reading together. After a couple months after that, we said, hey, let's publish a journal together, and everything just steamrolled to the point where, like, after 5 years, we had grown the budget from zero to $750,000. I mean, it was crazy how fast it grew. We ran the largest Asian American bookstore in the country. We started publishing books, and we won the American Book Award with one of our anthologies. We were giving $10,000 scholarships to people. We were connecting writers with a fellowship program, which connected them with a team of support, including an agent from ICM, um, you know, uh, uh, an editor from Simon and Schuster, a professor from Columbia, and another professional writer to sort of serve as a team, for a whole year. So we're doing all these really, really wonderful, wonderful things. But as much as I loved the organization, I also knew that if I stayed much longer, because I was the first executive director, I knew that if I stayed, maybe I might get into that trap of never doing my own writing, right? Because in running that organization, I had to set aside some of my own writing to, literally write grant proposals and take fundraising meetings and, develop a board of directors and all this other administrative stuff. So it was a good win-win for both of us to sort of walk away because in the nonprofit field, you have this thing called founder syndrome a lot, where the founders stay on a little too long and they don't allow the organizations to sort of breathe and become their own separate entities. And I didn't want that for the Writers Workshop. As much as I love all the success of the group, since then, I knew it was time to walk away. But just to show you, if you guys haven't heard of the organization, if your readers haven't or your listeners haven't, it's a who's who of Asian American writers. Like Minjin Lee is on the board, Hua Shu, who just won the Pulitzer, is on the board, Alexander Chi was on staff, Hanya Yanagihara was the editor of our journal, Lisa Ko, who was a national book finalist, also was on the journal staff, Kathy Park Hong was an intern, Ocean Vong had his first reading there, Juba Lahiri taught classes there. It's like literally, name somebody in Asian American writing, from a certain time period, and they all were there. You know what I mean? And it's just such a great feeling. And I actually said to people, it's like, if I never wrote and published my own book, I actually would have been fine, because of the work that I had done in terms of advancing Asian American literature through that organization. And that's why for me, even though I'm an older writer, like I'm 55 years old, to have my first book, I wasn't pining for my own book for all those early decades because I felt like, I had already helped advance the field of literature in such a way. So yeah, my heart, special heart place in my heart for that organization.
That's amazing. Cool. So if someone wants to learn more about it, where would they go?
Oh, they can go to the website, aaww.org.
That's simple enough.
Yeah.
Thanks for
So
telling.
Curtis, we are our half an hour has gone by in a blink, and it has
Okay.
been a
Sorry.
pleasure.
I give long
But
answers.
no, it's been a lovely conversation. So
Yeah.
tell us, Curtis, what's next for you?
Oh my God. Okay. Quick. I mean, there's so much because my day job is actually TV film. But so one of the things I'm going to do is for my paperback release, which comes out October 1st, there are 24 chapters in my book. I'm going to do 24 readings, but every single one of them is going to be at a Chinese restaurant. And all my conversation partners are going to be either the chef, the waiter, the owner, or some family member, because I want them to also share their story, right? My tagline is every restaurant has a story. But I also want them to talk about the challenges that Chinese restaurants are facing post-COVID, because there's been a high failure rate, not just like, the issues that are facing all food service industries right now, but because of some lingering racism, around coronavirus, Wuhan virus, or whatever, some awful people were saying about it. It's really impacted a lot of these businesses. And so I want to do that. And I think that I'm starting the process of possibly raising the funds to shoot that as a docuseries, an 8-part docuseries, which is actually charting the history of Chinese restaurants in America. So I want to do that. I also have I'm working on a second memoir. Uh, Sadly, when my parents were in a car accident a few years ago, my dad passed away. And I was writing for the Disney Channel at the time, and I actually had to leave the show that I was working on to go back home and make the fateful decision of whether or not to go back to Hollywood and be a writer, which is it was hard for Asian American writers in Hollywood back then. Or do I stay back in Detroit and take over my family's business? And so that book I'm working on, it's a book called Leftovers. Um, and there's a couple other projects I'm working on, but those are the two key ones that I'm really thinking about. I'm happy to say that my book came out October 17th, and I just found out it's already in its third printing.
Wow.
So yeah, it's
Great.
flying off the shelves, I mean, everywhere, which is great. So that hopefully, according to my agents, will give me more freedom to sort of pursue the projects I want to do. So.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, Curtis. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and chat with Jeffrey and me.
Oh, loved it. Yeah, hopefully we can all do it in person
I would
sometime.
love that. It's a
Yeah.
date. We'll have
Okay.
Chinese.
Yeah. I can't cook though, so I won't be cooking, but we can go to a
Okay.
nice restaurant.
I
Okay?
can't cook either.
Okay.
So, gentle listeners, it's been a pleasure. Until next time, I'm Robert Gwaltney for Inside Voices.
And I'm Jeffrey Dale Lofton. And remember, to be creative is to be courageous. Thanks for joining us.